So welcome everybody. This is a conversation about a book, Chris Smaje's book, A Small Farm Future. This is the said Chris Smaje, who we're super delighted to have here at the Green Gathering. My name is Rupert Reed. I'll be your host here and giving some talks in the next few days here and elsewhere. I'm part of the Transformative Adaptation group. We've got a number of events going on here in Voices of Gaia, also down the hill in the Transformative Adaptation area. Do come and visit us there if you want to find out more about what Transformative Adaptation is. You'll hear a little bit more in the course of the next hour. What we're going to do in the course of the next hour is that Chris and I are going to have a conversation about his book and about issues coming from the book. We know that some of you have read the book, but presume that the majority of you probably haven't, so we won't assume any prior knowledge. If you really like the conversation and are still here at the end, Chris will then sit behind the table and sign copies of the book, which he's brought with him in his cycling saddlebags. He's cycled here, true Green Gathering commitment.
So please buy
living the dream. Yeah, I mean that's the real point. That's the real point. If you pity Chris at all, if you like him at all by the end of this hour, please help lighten his load on the way home. It's a bit like kind of coming here out of the sun into the shade. It's like a very practical motivation for chipping in and helping him out. We decided in Transformative Adaptation that we wanted to host this event because we believe that Chris's book is a very important book. It is a rare book because it is a book that combines an extremely practical vision about agriculture with a rich theoretical and intellectual heritage and rationale. In my opinion, a very, very impressive book. So we really wanted to have Chris here, and I'm delighted that you were able to come. So what's going to happen is that I'm going to ask Chris a few questions about the book and about his project, and we'll devolve into a little conversation probably from that, and then at some point I'll throw it open to the room for questions and discussion, and then, as I say at the end, if you're still here and still enthusiastic, you can do the right thing by helping lighten Chris's load on the bike ride home, because these books are not slim. They are weighty, weighty little volume, paperback, but it's quite heavy paper. It's Chelsea Green, a very, very good publisher who use very good quality paper. One of their many virtues. So Chris, start us off by telling us something about A Small Farm Future. What is the essence of what you've got to say in this book? And why did you decide to write it?
Right. Well, I suppose I started off trying to run a small farm. We've got in northeast Somerset near Frome, we've got an 18-acre site, and out of some kind of crazy naivety or early onset midlife crisis or something, I kind of thought, I'll give up my academic job and be a farmer, and started a little local veg box scheme. And I guess in a sort of fairly tangible way, you can sort of read about the way that the sort of global system is dysfunctional and isn't serving farmers, and the food system is got multiple problems. But I suppose doing it kind of brought that home to me, and in some ways, I guess there can be quite a superficial level where we think about the food system and think, well, it's good to buy local, there's all these debates, sort of meat or vegan, organic, or whatever. But I think we're facing such a kind of deep systemic underlying crisis that doesn't really sort of come through in those debates. So part of the rationale for the book is to really think more deeply and systemically about local food. So I start the book by going through various crises. I know it's all a bit kind of doom and gloom, but things like climate change, things like energy futures, so much of the way that we organise ourselves in the modern world in general, and certainly in the food system, is we've become very accustomed to abundant, cheap energy, basically fossil energy, and lots of people have ideas that we can replace that with cleaner forms of energy, which I'm doubtful that we can do that at the level and the cost to which we've become accustomed. And so many of the problems of the food system stem from the way we've sort of scrambled and dismantled more sustainable low input food systems. So I kind of wanted to start from there. So we really need to sort of think about a local economy in which food and fibre production is at the heart of that. How will we get through this period where all of these dynamics, climate change, energy, socioeconomic problems, water, soil, and so on, we're going to have to rethink these literally from the ground up. So that's kind of what I try and do in the book, and think about what would it look like if if we genuinely did have a small farm future, if we had a society organised around small scale local production of food and fibre, and we need to restructure the economy in such a way that we're investing in low carbon job rich sectors, and farming can be one of those sectors.
Notice that term job rich, by the way, folks, right? Whenever you hear somebody say, oh yes, but it's awfully labour intensive, isn't it? Right, flip that on its head, and it's job rich, right? People need to have stuff to do, people need to have meaning in their lives, people need to have sustenance. It's not a bad thing when you provide jobs to people.
It's a real irony that, in most economic sectors, if you hear, jobs, there are new jobs have been created in this sector, and we say, oh great, whereas farming is almost alone, where the whole the sort of general public ethos is like, it's we've saved labour, we've got jobs out of farming, but globally that's not what we need to be doing. We don't want sort of people talk about back-breaking labour, which we don't want people to be toiling away in miserable poverty, but that's largely a function of the political and economic system, not intrinsic to farming, as I argue in the book.
Yeah.
So,
people say people don't want to work on the land anymore, but that's not your experience or your vision, Chris.
No, I mean, we've got any number of people who are desperate to come and work with us, and we were just talking before we came in, the Oxford Real Farming Conference. I don't know if many of you are aware of it, but there's the sort of big corporate Oxford Farming Conference where all the big agribusiness folks come, and the Secretary of State comes and speaks there. And so about a little more than 10 years ago, some alternative farmers started what they called the Oxford Real Farming Conference. And when I first started going to that, it was mostly kind of older. I was one of the youngest people there, and it was mostly people who were sort of real die-hard organic farmers. But over the last 10 years, more and more young, well-educated, dynamic, thoughtful people have come. The conference has swelled because people do want to farm. They don't want to be kind of screwed and have their sort of nose to the grindstone, but people at so many levels, so many different people coming to our farm, wanting to get involved, wanting to know how to produce vegetables, wanting to sort of get their hands in the soil. And that's what we need to figure out. We need to figure out economic systems that make it possible for people to do that. Ultimately, that's how we're going to get through globally. And more and more people are interested in it. I mean, I think in some ways the term farm can put people off, because people have an image of a farmer. It's quite gendered often. It's a sort of the idea of a guy in a big tractor in a big field, but most farmers globally are women, mostly on small plots, mostly producing for their own families, and that's kind of the image. I think even if you're just living in a city, growing a few herbs on a windowsill, in my book you're a farmer. There's a gradation from there, through to there is some big scale field agriculture, but really we're talking about small scale local production for local needs that everybody can participate in one way or another, or if not directly by supporting local producers.
So what you've just said there, Chris, is that in much of the world already we have a small farm present. Mm-hmm. People say that's the past. You're saying, no, that's actually the future. Do you think, hand on heart, do you think a small farm future is possible?
I do think it's possible, hand on heart. it's not necessarily likely. I mean, I think there's a lot of forces pulling against it, and one of the main forces is it's kind of almost it's a cultural, or even you might say a spiritual force that's pulling against it, in terms of, you know, we've got very caught up in this modern notion of progress, that exactly as you just said, that farming is something that people did in the past, and, you know, we've moved beyond that, but that's, you know, people didn't necessarily want to stop farming. You know, there's been processes of active, you know, people have been divested from the land. You know, basically people seek prosperity, you know, in fact, not only people, I would say organisms in general, you know, they seek prosperity, they seek the best possible life that they can achieve. You know, historically in recent times in the world, that has often, as a result of this cheap, abundant energy, that's often been a sort of urban industrial way of life, has been the easiest way to do that. But I think, you know, long term we need, you know, that's kind of based on this kind of short term cheap energy party that we've been having, and it hasn't actually benefited the majority of people in my opinion. You know, longer term we need to build a more sustainable agroecological culture, and I think that means that, you know, we're not going to be able to mine fossil fuels and concentrate. It means we've got to spread out and kind of skim local resources. So yeah, absolutely, I think the future is going to be rural, because so much of the kind of urban, high energy, concentrated sort of ways of life that we've become accustomed to are essentially enabled by easy energy, easy water. You know, we're not going to be able to do that long term. We're going to need to be, you know, where we can, you know, tap the energy from the sun, you know, spread out, skim, don't mine, skim, you know, make it renewable. And to do that, you know, it means a lot more people have got to be involved in farming. So the question then is sort of the politics around that, and ensuring that it's not some kind of neo-feudal nightmare where, you know, where a few people are kind of skimming off the benefits of that. But yeah, hand on heart, I think we can achieve that. Part of the problem, though, is building a different story, you know, building a different narrative where that feels possible.
You heard it here, folks. You heard it here first. The future is rural. And I think you've expressed very well so far, Chris, how your book is very unusual, because you're coming from a very unusual place. You're an academic who became a farmer.
Right.
Quite rare. I mean, I'm also kind of the same, but in a much smaller way. My wife and I are smallholders. In fact, our smallholding is so small, we call ourselves tiny holders. But even that is pretty rare among academics. So there's this big kind of rupture between theory and the mind on the one hand, and practice and the land on the other. And one of the things which is beautiful about your book and your life is that you're really trying to heal that divide.
Right, yeah, I mean, and it's been very much a sort of learning journey for me. I mean, you know, there's a whole story. I don't really tell it in the book. The book focuses more on, you know, putting this into a bigger global picture. You know, hopefully someday I'll tell the story of our holding, which a planning officer, you know, we went through a long battle to be able to live on the holding, which is fairly critical in my view. You've got to kind of be there and live it and breathe it day to day. But, you know, we had a big battle with the local planning authority, and at one point one of the planners told me that I wasn't a proper farmer, which I now wear as a badge of honour. You know, not a proper farmer should be on. And, you know, it's been you know, it's a lifelong, you know, I don't have a farming background or a particularly practical background, so it's been a real you know, learning journey which is never over. But again, you know, that's a big theme in our culture. We've got to heal this rift between the sort of cerebral and the practical.
Yes. Yes.
You know, and the spiritual and the economic. You know, we've got to bring all these things together in a more holistic way of thinking about you know, who we are and what we're doing on this planet. You know, so yeah.
So we've answered the question, is a small farm future possible? And we've sort of assumed that a small farm future is desirable. Now let's drill into that question for a minute. As there's a big name in these parts, as it were, who's arguing at the moment that it's not. So George Monbiot's book, Regenesis, sold even more copies than your book so far. George's vision is basically most of our protein and many of our calories in the future will come from vats. We'll grow stuff industrially in vats, and then we'll free up vast amounts of land for rewilding. Now, why isn't that a better future than the future that you're trying to paint for us and trying to create?
Well, I love George. I've got a lot of time for him. He's done amazing stuff. I think he's kind of veered off-piste in his latest book, I think out of a sense of desperation, probably. I mean, we were talking about that.
I think that's right.
But I think there are big problems, and you can look at them at various levels. I mean, there are sort of technical issues with, basically what he's suggesting is, as you say, so-called precision fermentation of food that requires energy input. It's one of these sort of eco-modernist techno-fix ideas that we're going to have abundant, cheap, clean energy in the future. My view is that we're not. Energy is going to be quite squeezed in the future. There's going to be a lot of different calls upon energy. It doesn't make sense to be generating, if you think about generating electricity, whether it's nuclear power or PV panels or wind, there's a huge kind of industrial technology around that to generate the electricity and then produce the food, as compared to the free solar energy that you get if you're growing food in a garden or in a field. I mean, it's a no-brainer to me, At that technical level, I think his idea only works if you assume that we're going to have abundant, clean energy in the future. But I think, there's always the sort of immediate technical issue, but then there's a kind of cultural or spiritual issue underneath it. And I think George, I kind of understand where he's coming from in terms of rewilding and the need to leave land for nature. I think it's very sort of dualistic, his book. It's like farming, farming can challenge or can be a negative for wildlife, but it's a bit all or nothing. So he sort of argues, this can be problematic, therefore we shouldn't be doing it at all, and there is kind of a middle ground between that. But I think, my big fear about it is that it ends up as this sort of complete alienation. Why would people who are living in cities eating food that's sort of generated industrially, why would they care about nature? And there's levels of, there's sort of political questions there about or sort of social justice questions. I think it may well be that rich people will still want to eat beef raised on big ranches, and that his kind of sort of biofermentation thing will be sort of food for the poor, a bit like the whole kind of golden rice idea. So I think there's levels and levels, but for me fundamentally it's we have to kind of spread out. We have to be other organisms living, being part of the ecology, figuring out how to make our living like all the other organisms, not concentrating in cities. And George talks about we have to be realistic about the mathematics, and he sort of argues, well, we're all living in cities a long way from breadbasket regions. I mean, it's not about mathematics, it's about history, it's about people being divorced from the land historically and the need to reconnect ourselves with the land. So he's actually
depoliticized the history on that point in your view.
He very much has, and it kind of surprises me because a lot of his other writing, he's deeply aware of histories of access to land and people being divorced from land, but he's kind of saying, you just look at the maths. I accept the point that it's a tall order because we are very concentrated globally, and certainly in a country like Britain, it's a very urban society. How do we de-urbanize? It's kind of easier to urbanize than it is to de-urbanize. So I'm not saying it's easy, but ultimately I don't think that urbanism is a very high energy way of organising society, and people sort of get this a bit wrong. You often hear, well, you can live a greener lifestyle in the city. you kind of can if we're talking about high energy modern lifestyle. You know, it's easier to live a high energy modern lifestyle in the city than a high energy modern lifestyle in the countryside if you're driving everywhere. But ultimately, if you're living a low energy lifestyle, which I think we will need to in the future, it's going to be very hard to sustain that, you know, with high levels of urbanisation. And also, you know, I think we actually do need to, you know, we need to learn to be part of the ecology again, you know, which you can do to some extent in cities. But ultimately, you know, we need to, you know, that's one of the best arguments for ruralisation, I think, is that, you know, if you're producing the food and fibre that you need locally, you can see the consequences of your action. There's a kind of feedback loop, whereas if you just go to the shop, buy it, you know, you've got no idea where it came from, the conditions under which it was produced, you know, the ecology, the social, you know, you know, the sort of labour conditions in which it was produced, and so on and so on. So, you know, I think for me a lot of different factors point towards relocalisation, you know, however difficult that might be.
If people are living more locally, it's easier to understand that there is no way you can throw things into. We both have a colleague, Helena Norberg Hodge, who tells this brilliant story of she was in Ladakh, little Tibet, some years ago. She was washing her clothes in a stream, and a 4-year-old girl wanders up and says to her, "You can't wash your clothes in that stream." And Helena was like, "Oh, really? Well, why not?" The little girl said, "Because there are people living downstream there and you're dirtying their water." You know, that's the kind of consciousness that is much easier for someone to access if they're living with other people in the place where they get most of what they need and produce, etc., rather than a place where things are provided for them on the basis of purchasing, etc.
Yeah, and I mean, we are starting from quite a low base into, you know, even the sort of basic knowledge like that I think, you know, is which, you know, is where we live. It's kind of, you know, in many ways, you know, I try at some level to practice what I preach, and we live largely off grid, but you know, I live a very privileged, you know, high consumption lifestyle by any global standards. But even so, just, you know, when you're relying on the sun or the wind to provide your energy, it just connects you. You know, you can't just flip a switch and expect to, you know, wash your clothes or whatever it might be. And you know, we just need to get into that kind of way of thinking again.
But let me ask you a question about whether there really has to be such an opposition between your vision and George Monbiot's vision in Regenesis. What if I were to make the following argument? Quite a lot of the meat, and especially dairy, that we produce gets used in ingredients of things like cakes, for example, right? The dairy, not the meat, in the case of cakes. That could, in theory, be replaced by this mass-produced protein, etc., fermented in vats. If the Monbiot vision were realised, that could free up lots of land for rewilding, but also potentially for small farms. The price of land under Monbiot's vision would probably drop a lot, because land wouldn't be needed, so it wouldn't be under such pressure to grow food. So is it not possible that there's actually a confluence between George's vision and yours?
It's certainly possible, and I mean, you know, I wrote a review recently of his book where I made the point that, you know, I'm not intrinsically against some of these, you know, the fact that it's kind of a new food that's, you know, that's not precedented is not intrinsically problematic. I mean, I think, you know, technologies always have a social context where, I mean, I sort of play with that a bit in the book where, you know, people often say, you know, if people who are speaking up for nuclear power say, you know, often say we need every tool in the box. So I'm like, great, why not have nuclear power stations and horse-powered agriculture, or, you know, using scythes or whatever, and you know, and we don't sort of tend to have those hybrid systems because technologies sort of tend to be, you know, there's a kind of economic driver, which is essentially a sort of capitalist growth system, which is always about, you know, making it as cheap as possible. And that's, you know, that's an issue we've wrestled with on the farm, that human labour is dear energy, fossil energy is cheap. So in a commercial farming situation, you're always pushed towards the cheap energy, minimal labour approach. But I agree with you. There is, there's potential for, for substituting. I mean, I think you sort of touched on the issue of livestock agriculture, and I mean that has been a disaster of cheap energy, cheap fertilizer. Most agricultural systems historically have used livestock when energy is scarce, and if you don't have a farm animal to do it, you have to do it yourself by hand. And in that situation, livestock, they're basically all tappers and cyclers of nutrients that are hard for people to access, ourselves so easily. So they fit into the farm ecology. But what we've done in the modern world is, we've taken them out of that ecology. We've used cheap fertilizer, cheap energy. We've maxed out on the meat, crammed all these poor animals in horrific sort of industrial facilities, and then you end up in a situation where the manure, which used to be a precious input into the farm system, becomes this god awful pollutant. So we need to kind of unpick all of that and put it back together in a different way. And I agree with you that if we did that, there would be room for a little bit of livestock agriculture. There might be room for George's vision, but you have to, you have to sort of build it up in terms of a fully specified ecological and social vision, not just sort of taking people out of the sort of wild ecology, putting them in cities and sort of treating them as, feeding them as a sort of problem to be solved. Yeah,
and your argument is quite powerful, that you believe people need to get their hands dirty, they need to tread on the land, they need to have green fingers, that if we don't do this kind of thing, then we're likely to be dangerously alienated from the land and from the ecosystem of which we're a part. But of course, one of the central difficulties you're up against, and perhaps in some sense we're all up against, is you mentioned it before, story. So the overriding story in our civilization is of progress, and people look at the idea like a small farm future, and they, well, that's not progress. How can you argue for that? So let me ask you this final question before I throw the floor open to questions and discussions from the room. In the transformative adaptation approach, we argue that an essential ingredient for being able to coherently envision the future is robust realism about the fact that the vision of progress that we've been sold is a lie. If it was ever possible, it's not possible now. It's only possible at the unsustainable cost to the land, to peoples in other lands, to future generations, to non-human beings, and that the chickens are very much coming home to roost in, the wrong kind of chickens, not the kind that you talk about so wonderfully in your book. And he does talk very wonderfully about chickens in the book. We've got to be able to challenge that story of progress. We've got to junk the vision that this civilization, which thinks it can eternally grow and progress, is possible or necessary or desirable. We've got to accept that we're in the age of consequences. We've been seeing that this summer with the unprecedented heat wave, which has woken up another tranche of people. We've got, therefore, to adapt to the climate damage that is here and the worst damage that is coming. And we've got to transform our system into a system that can actually last. And obviously, one of the key reasons why we invited you to come and speak here today is that we see something like a small farm future as a key part of that system transformation. How does that vision strike you? How much in sync do you see yourself with this picture of transformative adaptation as the kind of way we ought to frame or reframe what we need to do as a civilization?
Yeah, absolutely aligned with it. And, I think adaptation is key because, again, one of our modern vices, I think, is to think that there's kind of going to be some easy techno fix that, you know, we can just sort of solve this problem with some technology and then we can carry on as before. And you kind of get that in the alternative farming movement a little bit as well, with certain, you know, if we farm in this way, we can sequester all the carbon, and you know, so yeah, we need to move beyond that. But you know, and partly it's a deeper malaise of modernity, I think, and we're sort of victims of this sort of 19th and 20th century politics, where again we sort of, you know, we have these in social terms as well, you know, people have these kind of single keys that, you know, on the right wing sort of say, if we let market forces, you know, market forces will sort it all out, or, you know, the left wing has tended to be, you know, class struggle, let sort of working class politics will organise, will take over the state. But then that become, you know, what happens when you take over the state, it, you know, it becomes a very sort of technocratic set of arguments about you know, growing the economy and producing more and just distributing it better, which is not the answer either. So, but, you know, and there is a, you know, there are traditions of, you know, it's almost like the term romantic is a dirty word, but, you know, there is a romantic tradition, you know, people like John Ruskin, William Morris, you know, the distributists. We were talking about Wendell Berry earlier. You know, there's a kind of hidden tradition of people thinking about this in a very different way and trying to, which you can't necessarily classify on a sort of left-right continuum of people thinking about kind of human scale. You know, Schumacher obviously would be another example. Human scale.
Illich, Gandhi.
Illich, yeah, exactly. And they tend to sort of, I mean, Gandhi is a great example, the whole kind of Indian independence movement that was with that sort of notion of an autonomous local village really central to it. And now we have Modi and sort of neoliberal industrialization. And that is the problem, I think, is that it's easier, you know, it's easier to get figures like Modi or Lenin or whoever, you know, someone who sort of makes a powerful claim on the central state. And that's what we kind of need to resist and create a new politics around, which is hard to do because, you know, it's easier for the centralisers to, you know, grab the organs of power than it is for the, you know, for this more diffuse localist sort of argument. But that's why I totally endorse your vision of transformative adaptation, sort of locally in place where we are making alliances with other people. You know, this isn't about sort of, you know, I'm all right Jack sort of localism and everyone else can sort of, you know, it's kind of, it's building alliances with other people, but essentially not trying to solve all the problems of the world with a kind of single one answer, but you know, doing difficult work locally to you know, to build up capacity.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris.